It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Suneil Koliwad, who is an investigator in the UCSF Diabetes Center and Department of Medicine, where he holds the Brodsky Chair in Diabetes Research. He's a board-certified endocrinologist who attends on the Diabetes and Endocrinology Services at San Francisco General Hospital. He earned his PhD and MD degrees from the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and after completing a chief residency at the Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital, he joined the UCSF Gladstone Institute of Cardiovascular Disease. Since becoming a faculty member at UCSF, his lab is focused on how nutrients, inflammation, and metabolism intersect to produce serious diseases such as diabetes that are linked to obesity. He's also a frequent speaker on diabetes intervention and the use of precision medicine in the field of metabolic health. Please help me welcome Dr. Koliwad.
So, can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Great. So I normally give my talks in different settings with slides and PowerPoint and all the rest of it. But I find sometimes that when we do that, it sort of lets people be passive listeners and not necessarily engage in the content of the conversation. And I want this to be much more interactive, specifically because I think that it may be the case that many of you have questions about diet, questions about exercise, questions about risk for diabetes, questions about management of diabetes, and questions about the complications of diabetes, which we can talk about. And so, with that in mind, I want to have this be as interactive and open a discussion as we can possibly have it be. And I'll start off just by asking a simple question, and then I'll maybe do a little bit of talking for a while, and then I'll open it up again and try to engage people in a little bit more of question and answer. And that will sort of let me know what direction to take the talk subsequently. So the question I have for you is, how many of you here have diabetes somehow impacting either yourself or someone you know, someone in your life, someone you're connected to? So it's a very common disease. I think that's really the point of bringing that up. So how common is diabetes? Well, you may not have seen this, and you shouldn't be concerned if you haven't, but as medical people, we were all taken aback by the issue of Lancet, which is like the New England Journal of Medicine, but in England and Europe, that came out yesterday. And in the issue, most of the issue is dedicated towards what they call, and I'd never heard this term and I'd never read this word, and I didn't even know this word existed, but they called it the syndemic of diabetes and obesity. And so I thought to myself, well, what's a syndemic? S-Y-N-D-E-M-I-C, syndemic. And what they meant by that was that it's the synergy, the intersection of multiple epidemics all at the same time. And they put forward the idea that this particular syndemic, and I'll tell you what is comprised in this in a moment, is a fundamental watershed for humanity as we think of it right now on the face of the earth. So then, that gets you thinking a little bit when you see something like that in the headline of an article in a magazine. And so the syndemic that they're talking about is an epidemic of obesity. So we could talk about that a little bit. Why is obesity so prevalent now compared to even 20 to 30 years ago? And I think that's very important. An epidemic of extremes of accessibility for some, and inaccessibility to good nutrition, inaccessibility to good places to exercise, inaccessibility to safe neighborhoods, inaccessibility to clean neighborhoods, and inaccessibility to the kind of education that provides insight into appropriate health-related decision-making that we all, some of us anyways, take for granted, that we know what's unhealthy when we see it. Too many people in the world don't know. They just don't have a frame of reference to identify what's unhealthy versus what's healthy, whereas other people have all of this. And the difference between the people who have and who have not has almost never been wider than it is now. So that's an epidemic. There's an epidemic of processed food that's available to us, and we can talk about what that is and why it is the case and what we can do about it. And then there's also an epidemic which in and of itself is not anything wrong or bad, but it is maybe an issue in the context of these other things, and that is the epidemic of globalization. So the movement of people. I was looking at the map that you all have outside, which shows in a pin where many of the people, if not all the people who are here, are actually from. And you see people from all over the country and many countries across the world. And I think if you look at in any group these days, you see increasingly a much more global population in every city in the country and in every country in the world. And I think that that's not without its consequences with respect to movement of genomes, people's genetics into new environments where they may be more at risk for diseases than they were in their old environment, mixing of the different germs that people carry from different parts of the world, and development of the mixture of all those germs in new places in the world, and many other aspects of globalization that if you take in the context of a warming world that's getting hotter as we go, and changing where crops and fresh foods are available, and where they're no longer readily able to be grown as easily anymore. And you start adding up all these worldwide factors, and it's somewhat catastrophic in terms of the health consequence to us right now. And so they made a bunch of recommendations in this Lancet article. But just like the global warming argument that many of you may be familiar with, the question is, are we at a point right now in history where we can actually stem the tide and reproduce health for our people? Or are we kind of doomed to go along a path where we're going to, as a population, experience consequences of poor health across a huge number of people before things actually get better? So I want to start at the beginning, and hopefully we'll get to a much more positive place at the end. But the first thing that I wanted to do is talk to you about why I got interested in diabetes in the first place. Diabetes to me is a readout. It's an indicator that a number of other things are not going the way they should be going in terms of overall health and wellness. And having your blood sugar rise is just a consequence in some people of that overall mismatching and overall poor health. So I got interested in diabetes because when I was in medical school, I started out interested in heart disease. And I thought I was going to go into cardiology because I would be able to work on people with diseased hearts and maybe even address people who had acute heart problems, heart attacks, chest pain, heart failure, and work on on reproducing a properly functioning heart so people could go back to normal way of life. And I worked in that capacity in my residency, and I remember really vividly because many of you may be aware. Where I was at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, it's a very big center in the country for cardiology and for heart management. The person who was the president of Baylor College of Medicine was an individual named Michael DeBakey, who pioneered the first bypass and aortic graft to create a new blood vessel so that you could bypass a diseased part of the aorta, and also for coronary bypass. And so heart surgery was very common in the Texas Medical Center and in Houston for several decades, and I was there training during that, sort of mature period of that heyday for Baylor College of Medicine. And I remember one night I was on call, and I don't know if anybody here, I met a few people who have a medical background. Anybody else have a medical background in their history somewhere along the line? So either as a patient, which many of us have now been through our lives, or if you were actually on the provider side of things, you may have a visceral memory of something that occurred in the middle of the night in the hospital. Lots of things happen in the middle of the night in hospitals. And I was on call, I was woken up, and there was a gentleman. Texas Medical Center has a lot of ICU beds, and this individual was in one of the ICU beds in what we call the coronary care unit, specifically in the heart failure unit, who was on the list for a heart transplant. And he had a machine in his heart, what we call an Lvad, or a left ventricular assist device. And this is a really cool little machine. Actually, it works on the principle of Archimedes' screw. It's like a little turning screw that's a little tiny machine in his heart. And that screw, when it turns, shoots the blood out so that it goes through the circulation. And he had that in there because his heart wasn't beating properly anymore, and it wasn't doing that pumping function like it's supposed to. So he was reliant on this little machine in the heart to do that work for him. And his blood pressure had fallen, so they called for all the on-call people to come to the bedside, and we were working on this individual to try to get his blood pressure up and get his circulation going again. And so I said that this heart assist device works because it's like a screw. And so it's constantly turning with a little battery, and the blood is just whooshing through his system. But because it works like that, the person doesn't have a heartbeat. There's no pulse. And so one of the things that you may have seen from like all your time watching medical shows or movies, or even having been a part of this yourself in one way or another, one of the first things you do when you come to the bedside is feel the pulse and feel the pulse. Well, if the person doesn't have a pulse, what is there to feel for? And so my heart, as his blood pressure was going down, my blood pressure was going up because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help this individual, but I knew that if the blood pressure stayed down and stayed down long enough, then he would probably expire. And so we started doing chest compressions and giving medications and trying to get his heart working again to produce enough of a blood pressure that we could keep him going until we could do something more definitive. And I know it was like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and people with more seniority than me at the time were on their way in from home, having been awoken because a lot of effort had been put in. Resources had been put in. Transplant system engaged. This individual had already had a device placed inside him. Thousands and thousands of dollars in effort spent, and the family's hopes and his hopes all on the line. We were in the middle of actually doing chest compressions like you see on TV. The senior cardiology fellow, who was like 5 years ahead of me in training, blurted out, I really should have gone into endocrinology. Right in the middle of all this. And, it struck me because I was still deciding what I wanted to do. I hadn't made up my mind yet. I was a resident. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'll tell you why I made that decision. Ultimately, that individual, unfortunately, didn't make it because we just couldn't do much in time to save him. But the reason I chose to do what I did is because I want to prevent heart disease. That's my goal. That's my professional mission, is to prevent heart disease. I don't want to be relegated to a medical system where what we can do is work on people whose heart isn't working anymore to try to see if we can give them another day or another month or another 6 months or maybe, if we're lucky, another few years. If we could also combine our efforts and prevent a lot of heart disease in the first place, I think maintaining wellness, maintaining the vitality and active engagement in life that many of you may be still enjoying, if we can maintain that, that would be a better goal. And so I thought to myself, well, what are the areas that are really up and coming for somebody to focus on if they wanted to prevent heart disease? Well, one of the areas was smoking, of course. I was not an epidemiologist, and so I didn't think that that made sense for me to go into. I had a basic science laboratory background, having done a PhD. And so then it started becoming clearer, this was about 1998, 99, that diabetes was emerging as a more and more common disease. And we now know that diabetes is the biggest risk factor for stroke, heart attack, and heart failure of all diseases that are in existence that we know of. It's a bigger risk factor, or at least as big a risk factor as smoking is. So, if an individual has had a heart attack in their life, okay, so this is somebody who you know can have a heart attack because they've already had one, and you're looking at their risk of having another heart attack at some point in their life, having diabetes increases your risk of having another heart attack as much or more than smoking does. So it's a huge risk factor. And its prevalence has only been going up since 1996, 97, 98. And along with it, we started getting wind of this oncoming epidemic of obesity. And obesity, of course, is a risk factor for diabetes. So I thought, if I went into endocrinology and focused on obesity and diabetes, I might actually be able to make a difference in rates of heart disease across the population. And so that's what I've been working on ever since then. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of this. And then we can open it up, because I think you may have some questions as well. And if you don't, I can stimulate some of them, because this is an area that affects all of us, because it's affecting our whole population. So we're lucky here in San Francisco because we live in one of the fitter parts of the nation. Colorado is the fittest state in the nation. I don't know if any of you know that. It has the most days of sunshine of any state in the country. It has the most square miles of outdoor space in the context of an urban center of any state in the country. National parks, relatively young, fit population. It's an incredibly a good example of how, if society decides to focus on health across the entire population by creating an outdoor engaging space where people can be out doing things, good health usually follows. Unfortunately, there are a lot of other places in the country that have the exact opposite kind of approach. So, for example, I was in Amsterdam, okay? And Amsterdam and Scandinavia in general has a pretty fit population. Not a lot of obesity and not as much diabetes in Scandinavia compared to the rest of the world. And if you go to any square, public square in Amsterdam, one thing that you see all over the place, does anyone know what you see a lot of in Amsterdam in the public squares, parks? Bicycles. Bicycles, bicycles, bicycles everywhere. It's amazing. And I thought to myself, boy, you know, if I was in Dallas, Texas, and I had a lot the size of one of these public squares, who in that municipality would ever commit that kind of valuable square footage in the center of the city to bike parking? Think of all the ways you could make money off of that square footage, even car parking, before you did bike parking. But in some societies, they emphasize bike parking because there's a common good aspect of that, so that you realize that if we make bikes easy to park for everybody, more people will ride bikes. And if more people ride bikes, more people will be physically active. And if more people are physically active, less people will get diabetes and diseases that spring from diabetes. I think we don't have that viewpoint in this country. And this is to our detriment. We're trying to do some things about it, but let me give you a little bit of a snapshot into what I see in my work in this area. I see my patients at San Francisco General Hospital. Does anybody know that hospital here? It's in the Potrero area near the Mission. right? So we see a vulnerable population of individuals in San Francisco. In fact, most of the homeless patients with diabetes and most of the homeless patients in general are seen at San Francisco General Hospital. And I can share with you, if you're interested, some amazing stories of people who don't have even a roof over their heads, who manage their diabetes, even though they don't have a refrigerator to put their insulin in. And it's amazing how well people do sometimes if they're motivated and if they feel like they have support to take care of themselves. So we see that population. And as a component of working there, I'm aware of research that has looked at diabetes rates across the entire city of San Francisco, dividing it by neighborhood. Okay? So where do you think the highest rates of diabetes are in San Francisco?
Tenderloin.
Tenderloin. Exactly right. Tenderloin and Bayview Hunters Point. That's where the highest rates of diabetes are. Right? And where do you think the lowest rates of diabetes are? Pacific Heights. Exactly right. Exactly right. So then if you use some big data, analytical approaches to say, well, why is that? What's really going on there? There are several things that come out. We talked at lunch with some of you about big data and computing power, and we'll get to that before the end of our time together. I think we have till 3, correct? Yeah. Okay. So what we found is, because you were right on with that. What we found is that the factors that correlate most, and this may be surprising because we just don't think of the impact of these things. But the factors that correlate most strongly with the neighborhoods with the highest rates of diabetes are the distance, physical distance from any individual living in that neighborhood to a market that sells fresh fruits and vegetables. Okay, and you can say fresh fruits and vegetables as a proxy for fresh foods in general. Okay? But that means that there are people in our own city where the closest 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places that they can go to buy food only sell processed food. In bags, in boxes, in cans, no fresh products easily available to them to buy. And if they don't have any automated way of transport and they can't readily afford mass transit on a daily basis, they may be stuck buying just whatever they can walk and get. And if that's what's close to them, then that's what they're going to buy. And furthermore, as many of you are also aware, the price of fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy has only gone up. Those things are not cheap anymore. And so, I ask the question to my patients, and when I give talks to patient groups, one of the things that we used to do when I was a kid was on Fridays or on Sundays sometimes we would make pizza at home, homemade pizza. And so the question is, my mom used to teach me that it's cheaper if you just cook your own food. Because it's just better and it's cheaper also to cook your own food. So go get groceries and make your own stuff instead of going out to eat as frequently. When you're in college and things like that, you tell your kids stuff like this. But in all honesty, there is no way today that you could make pizza at home with fresh ingredients for anywhere near as cheaply as you could buy a pizza at some of these low-end pizza places that people go to, like Little Caesars or Domino's, for example. $7.99. Sometimes $5.99 for a large pizza. There's just no way you could make a pizza that cheap. And so, if you're on food stamps and the month is about to finish, you can just do the math and you can figure out what people do. So there's more and more people in that boat. And I think that one of the things we really need to do, if we're going to stem the course of diabetes, is focus on how do we make sure that people across the board can get healthy food? If we can't do that here, we're in big trouble. And the rest of the world, we'll get to that in just a moment, the rest of the world is doing the same thing that we've been doing, except the pace of change in the rest of the world, in particular in Asia, East Asia, South America, Africa, Middle East, the pace of change is 10 times faster. than the pace of change in our country. Okay? So now let's get to some little bit of history about how we got here. Sticking still with the food. Okay? Still sticking with the food. We can talk about exercise too, but let's stick with the food because we've gone there. Who here has ever pickled anything? Right. So pickling or preserving, making preserves, is present in one form or another in every culture in the world. Whether you're burying fish deep under the snow, or whether you're making hot, spicy pickle in, a village in South India. This is a very ubiquitous thing. So why do you think all human beings in cultures throughout the world have in their cultures this idea of preserving and pickling food? Why? Why is it there?
Because there's no refrigeration.
No refrigeration, but why not just have fresh food? Before supermarkets, before our modern industrialized world, why not just eat the fresh food? Why have to save food in a cupboard or on a shelf?
For winter.
Winter. This is critical. This idea, now that we've gotten to that, will get us the rest of the way in this discussion. Winter. Until very recently, people, even people in the United States, if you go back about 120 years ago, people would lose a little bit of weight every winter and gain it back a little bit in the summer. Because food was less available in the winter. And to stave off starvation, we would preserve foods and we would keep foods so that we had a stockpile of food so that we could all be okay during the winter months. Specifically, the winter. Okay, now, along with that, when we went from hunter-gatherer to an agrarian economy, where we were growing our own foods and we were able to subsist off of what we could create out of the ground and then start mass producing that, one of the main components of that agrarian economy was grain. Okay? Throughout the world, rice and grain. You see it in one form or another everywhere. So, does anybody here remember, or still now maybe, make their own bread or bake bread? Yeah. So I'm not a big baker, but I do remember visiting my family in India as a kid, and I remember this would have been like the mid-70s into the early 80s. I remember going with my grandmother by foot, because it wasn't that far, like maybe 500 feet walk, like the third of a mile kind of walk, with a sack to the mill. And you would go to the mill, and the person would load up all the flour in the bag, and I would help her carry it back home. Okay? And in India, you make all kinds of food with that flour. The chapatis and all the flatbreads and everything that you may have heard of. Flour is used for all that stuff. But here's the punchline to this. That mill would give us whole grain. And the reason I say whole grain is because the milling was very coarse. It wasn't a fine mill. It was just a local mill. Well, if you go back 100 years ago, that's how all our flour was made in this country. Small, local mills. And most people would get bread that was baked locally. Okay? That's just the way we did it. We didn't say whole grain. We didn't do all that. Because there wasn't anything that wasn't whole grain. It was all whole grain. Whole grain comes because the mill that mills the flour is a very rudimentary mill, and it doesn't mill the grain finely enough that the seed coat, the husk, comes off. So when the seed coat and husk remains on the grain, we call that a whole grain. So if your mill can't get rid of that anyways, all you have is whole grain. So why don't we have whole grain now? Why do we have to pay extra and read the label so that we know that we're getting whole grain? Why isn't all the flour whole grain? The reason is because in the run-up to World War II, we thought, our military complex thought, erroneously perhaps, that the Nazis were producing kids that were going to be fundamentally stronger than our kids. That was their propaganda. They were trying to get us to believe this. So we thought we need to have stronger kids. So how do we get stronger kids? Well, we got to fortify the food that we feed our kids so that our kids grow stronger, bigger muscles and are just more robust. And so led all of the technology to create, ultimately, as a symbol of this, Wonder Bread. Have you all heard of Wonder Bread? Right, so what's the wonder in Wonder Bread? What's so wonderful about it? Well, what was wonderful about it at the time was that it was fortified with iron in the bread, right? Iron and minerals. Still to this day, cereals, breads, all the things that you may remember that were advertised for kids, they were advertising it because of the sugar. They could get the kids to want it, to make their mom buy it. But what they were advertising to the parents was that it was fortified with iron and minerals and all this good stuff, right? So here's the rub. In order to get iron into the flour to make that Wonder Bread, you have to mill the flour much, much more finely than you would normally have milled it. And that allowed them to fold in iron and other things in there. But the problem was, we completely recreated all our national milling strategy. So General Mills and Kellogg's and all these companies redid everything. They completely chucked all the old mills and brought in all these new high-tech, high-refined mills. Okay? And then we mass-produced all the breads and cereals, and we've never gone back. All right? But what we did when we did that was, we milled out all the seed coat and all the husk from the grain. And then we created enriched flour, enriched white bread. We created that. That wasn't there from the beginning. And so then we just started eating that. And we didn't think twice. We just went forward. And then in the 80s, there was a low-fat craze. Do you all remember the low-fat craze in the 80s? There was an author, I don't know if you remember this author, Jim Fixx. He was a marathon runner, and he wrote a lot of books in the 80s about espousing the low-fat diet and exercise. Okay? So if you exercised and ate a low-fat diet, you wouldn't get heart disease. That was the idea. But remember, you have to eat something. So if you don't eat fat, low-fat, what does that mean you are eating? Carbohydrates. Okay? Right? Because you got to eat something. You're going to eat protein, but we can't eat red meat for protein because of the fat. So now you're going to be eating, we said lean protein, fine, chicken, fish, but how are you going to get full? You can't just eat a chicken on your plate and that's all you're eating every day. So carbs. Everything low fat, high carb. But we didn't advertise it as high carb. We just advertised it as low fat. Low fat this, low fat that, low fat crackers, low fat cookies, low fat everything. And so we ate, and ate all this low fat food that was high carb, that was enriched without any of that whole grain anymore. Okay? And what happened was that into the 90s, we created an obesity epidemic. We created a problem with obesity because the calories and carbohydrates that we were consuming were forcing obesity, fat deposition in places that people in the society we didn't commonly see, and we started seeing obesity cropping up in kids and adolescents, and we didn't see that very commonly anymore. Now it's relatively common. And so now we're in this place where we have to go back and we have to purposely look at the label to buy whole grain breads and cereals. We eat brown rice because we say it's healthier. All of that to say that 120 years ago, we were just doing that anyways. We didn't have to say anything special about it because we didn't have the technology to create the unhealthy stuff that now we're trying to get rid of purposely. So we're like going completely around in a circle. Okay? That's one aspect. The other aspect, and I mentioned I'd get to this, with globalization, is that all of this is happening very rapidly in other countries. So, you know, it's amazing because India, I'll go back to that example because it's one I know. Traditionally, the matriarch would make a lot of the food at home. discourage people from eating out at restaurants and encourage eating home-cooked food. And I think that was true until maybe even 15 years ago or so. But 60 years ago, that was true in the United States too. People didn't go out like 3-4 times a week. They would go out more on special occasions and more to mark important events, but not on a daily basis. And they certainly wouldn't be eating pre-prepared foods on weeknights as frequently as we do today in many homes, right? But it's happening really fast in other places. China, same story. And what we're seeing in India and China as a result is really rapid rates of diabetes increasing in the society. So if you go to India and China now, the most lucrative businesses that are popping up are gyms and Weight Watchers and this sort of thing. It's amazing because you just wouldn't guess that societies like that are so traditional in so many ways are having to contend with this. At UCSF, we met with the largest hospital in Beijing, Peking Union Medical College. It's a 2,500 bed hospital. So that's like 3.5 UCSFs in size. And they said that they've created a program to do bariatric surgery. Does anyone know what bariatric surgery is? It's weight loss surgery, okay? They're doing it in China, not for weight loss, because there's not a lot of overt obesity in China. But they're doing it to get rid of diabetes in people who have it, for whom nothing else is working. Okay? That's how big of a deal it is in countries like China. And because so much is nationalized in countries like that, they can create a top-down strategy and push that on people as a way to deal with diabetes. Because they know that if the diabetes rate goes up above a certain percentage, productivity goes down because people can't work well if they have really bad diabetes, and you just can't let it get out of hand. So they're very worried about this. This is the top thing on their economic agenda in China, is limiting diabetes. We also got reached out to by Google. You think of Google as being like the forefront of technology. Well, one of the things that, and maybe you've seen some of these TV shows and movies about Google, but like two of the things that are like hallmark about Google is they have all the food available on site and they don't charge anything for it. You've heard about this, right? How Google works. And then they also, everyone's coding. Everyone's working on computer the whole day long, right? So, wait a second. Put that together from a physician's standpoint. You're sitting all day long, not doing anything but being at a computer, and that's what the company wants, because that's how they get productivity out of you. And they just keep giving you easy, free food all day long to keep you at your desk, not getting up and doing anything else. Well, what's happening? Obesity, diabetes, heart disease in young Google employees. And they're asking us, what can we do about this? And so I think people are really realizing that we've created a societal structure that's just fundamentally got problems with it right now. And we were doing things better a long time ago, and many of you are aware of how things were in that setting. I'll give you one last example and then get to UCSF and what we're doing. One last example. When I was a kid, if I had a baseball game afterward, I could go to McDonald's with my dad, right? We would go through the drive-thru and I'd get a cheeseburger, and I remember being proud of myself when I was big enough to finish it. I forget, maybe I was 7 or 8 years old and I couldn't finish it until a certain point. You have to get old enough that you can eat all that much, and I couldn't. But the thing is that nowadays, if you go to a McDonald's, first of all, there's a ton of more different burger items on their menu, and they're all probably 5 times as many calories as the cheeseburger used to have in the 70s. So that means that we are all living in a world where if you order one item, one menu item, nothing wrong with that. You're one person, you're ordering one menu item. You're not being a glutton, you're not being silly. But you're getting 5 times as many calories from that one order. So if you go to, any of these chain restaurants, Olive Garden, these so-called family-style restaurants, you just sit down and order one item off the menu. You're getting 5 times as many calories now as you used to get. So what does that mean? That means fundamentally that I have to be ultra-disciplined. I go to the restaurant, I order a enchilada, and I have to be smart enough to cut that enchilada in half and put half in a to-go box right off the bat, and then only eat the other half. But if I just eat the enchilada that I'm served and finish whatever's on my plate, I'm getting a ton of calories, way more than I would have gotten 20 years ago ordering the exact same menu, perhaps even at the exact same restaurant. That's unfair. To me, that's unfair because that's not our fault. We didn't ask them to make the plate full of much more rich food. They did that. We didn't demand that they do that. We weren't clamoring for bigger meals. They did that because many people know that if the right mixture of carbohydrates and fats and the content is there on the plate, many people will get hooked on that size of meal and demand it and want it and not feel satiated until they eat that much. That keeps them coming back to those restaurants, that keeps them buying those foods, but it's unhealthy for us. So we've got to be a fundamentally more vigilant society because all these other components where people I mean, the amount of money and wealth that's transferred in the food industry is, amazing, are becoming really super wealthy and have been for a very long time, and it's at the risk of our own health. So I think we need to just know that. Now, switching gears a little bit, the reason why this syndemic is going on, also having to do with globalization and having to do with individual responses, is fascinating. So we got interested in this more recently as a lab because living in San Francisco, we have an incredibly ethnically diverse population, which is one of the beautiful aspects of living in San Francisco, is that we have that diversity right here in our own backyard. Well, one of the things that's interesting about that is that one of the aspects of physical diversity, the way people look, has to do with where people store the fat in their bodies. Okay? So for example, if I ask you to envision an individual who is African American and who is obese, you may think of somebody who has fat in the buttocks and thighs and arms and the external peripheral aspect of the body. And that's because that ethnic group commonly stores fat in those regions of the body. But if I ask you to envision a South Asian like myself or Chinese man who's obese or overweight, first of all, you may not even be able to readily envision somebody like that because it's not common to see. But if you did, you would see somebody who did not have a lot of fat in the arms or legs or buttocks or thighs, but right here, a pot belly, just one punch, and that's it. That's obesity, writ large, in that ethnic group. Very different appearance, okay? Samoans are like the most extreme example of this principle because Samoan individuals have the capacity to develop profound obesity, and other ethnic groups just cannot, no matter how much they eat, ever become fat obese. But it's even more interesting than that. That diversity is really fascinating because we're all people. So what is it that causes all these different appearances in people? But that's not it. That's not the only thing that's interesting. What's really even more interesting is that if you take the Chinese man with the pot belly and the Samoan man who looks like they're overweight from 50 feet across the room, if you ask for the degree of obesity, who has the greater risk for developing diseases linked to that obesity? It's the Chinese man. Even though the Samoan man is much, much more obese, they are able to tolerate that obesity in a way that the Chinese individual in my example is not. We don't understand why those differences exist, but we are seeing this because we're seeing more obesity in all groups, and we're seeing that some ethnic groups can handle it, some ethnic groups really cannot handle it. And that is creating a lot of this epidemic of diabetes, is because when enough people in the society overall develop the obesity component, some people are going to start dropping off with disease faster than others. And our job now is to try to understand what drives that risk. And so we've been working at UCSF in my lab on trying to understand ethnically specific drivers of diabetes. And what we found is that when some people develop obesity over their lifetime, from their 20s into their 30s into their 40s, they develop something we call fibrosis, or said more simply, a form of scarring in the fat tissue. You can't see it. You can feel it sometimes when you examine somebody, but you can't see it or notice it if it's you or if you see somebody who you know. But that scarring promotes the fat from what we eat to go into places in the body where it should not go. So obesity does not produce disease because of the fat itself, even though that's what we see. Obesity produces disease because of where the fat goes outside of the fat tissue. And that is because when everybody reaches a limit of how obese they can become, and that limit is determined by their ethnicity. And when you reach that limit, you don't change your lifestyle. You don't know you've reached that limit. You have no way of understanding that that's happening. But over the subsequent several years to decades, the fat that you eat and generate has got to go somewhere. Where does it go? It goes into your muscle. We know that this happens because you've all eaten meat that has come from an overfed animal, and you've seen the marbling of the muscle, and that is fat intercalated into the muscle. Well, that happens in people too. And that intramuscular fat produces diabetes, clearly. Fat deposits in the pancreas, which makes insulin. And the pancreas isn't as good at making insulin when it becomes fatty. And that contributes to diabetes. Fat intercalates into the liver, and we develop something called fatty liver. And many Asians are very, very at risk for fatty liver disease, as are people in other ethnicities as well. But fatty liver produces insulin resistance in the liver, and that contributes to diabetes. So we are now getting a better understanding of some of these drivers of diabetes risk in individual ethnic groups. And my lab has started a cohort. We're up to about 175 people now on whom we have fat biopsies, little tiny biopsies of their fat tissue, blood samples, stool samples, urine samples, whole body imaging with ultrasound, and then a number of questionnaires that they answer about how they eat, what they eat, measures of stress, depression, mood, and all kinds of things. And we're correlating all of that with disease risk to try to understand what drives disease risk in all these diverse populations, using our city as the source of that diversity. And so that's kind of where my lab is right now, because what I want, I don't know if anybody here has heard of the drug metformin. Metformin is a very common diabetes drug. It's the most common diabetes drug of all. Very old drug, wonderful drug. Tends to work really well on most people for many, many, many years before it ceases working. But it doesn't work on everybody. Furthermore, no medicine works on everybody. There's always some people in whom this tried and true medicine doesn't work. So how many of you here have had an experience either with yourself or with your doctor, or with a relative or friend, where they got a medicine and the medicine either gave a side effect or didn't work for what they wanted? It's common, very common, right? But we don't understand how to predict who will respond to what and who won't respond to what. But what we're doing at UCSF, and my lab's example, is just a way to make the larger point that what we're now doing at UCSF is we're trying to gather all the data relevant to you and you and you and you and you and everybody in our patient population. That means clinical data from all your visits, the medications that you've taken, all your laboratory data, imaging studies, and then even things that we do specifically just to document how you're doing, generally speaking, like a blood test and a urine sample and a stool sample, for example. And then analyze all of those things. Use high-powered computing to integrate all of those data, and then be able to use that in comparison with similar data sets for thousands and thousands of people at UCSF and across the country, if not around the world, and take all of the power from that data and predict if you get diabetes, you need to be on this drug and this drug and this drug, but not this drug because it won't work. Okay? And you need to eat this and this and this, but skip this because that will be very bad for your diabetes if you eat it. If you could know that, if you could get that kind of information, I think it would be really great. Right? I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, we're not there. But this is where UCSF is trying to go. And we call this precision medicine, meaning that the medicine is precise to the individual. The approach is precise to the individual. And I'll give you an example of this principle. There was a study done at the Weizmann Institute in Israel 2 years ago now. And they used a glucose monitor. I don't know if any of you have seen a glucose monitor. It's a little tiny needle under the skin. You don't feel it. And then they put a tape over it. And then there's a machine that senses your blood glucose continuously. And you can get the reading of your blood glucose throughout the day and night for 7 days. And then you switch it to another needle and you can do it for another 7 days. So it gives you a continuous reading. You don't have to prick your finger, which a lot of people with diabetes have to do. It's fabulous. What they did was, though, they put this on regular old people, not people with diabetes, but just anybody. And they asked them to just eat foods. And what they found was fascinating. They found that white bread, that bread that I told you is so bad for us, that we all know is bad for us, it made most people's blood sugar go up. But some people it didn't. They were like fine. Their bodies did not, have their sugar go up when they ate it. Other people, and this was the notable example in the paper, when they ate tomato, there was a handful of people in the study, when they ate tomato, blood sugar skyrocketed through the roof. They didn't know that. They had no way of knowing that. We had a conversation about this very kind of principle, basically, at lunch today. How would they know? But now we have the technology to let people get that kind of insight about themselves, or create tests to say, you know what, you have a blood test phenotype that is very similar to that of people whose blood sugar goes up when they eat tomato. So maybe you want to cut back on the tomato portions in foods that you eat because it might have a bad impact on your sugar. And you can just take that principle across all foods. And there's probably people who respond strangely, if you will, uniquely to any kind of food. But they just don't know it, because how could they know? But they do. And we can find out about that, and we can feed that information back to our patients now. And for the first time, you'll have an informed way of living your life that takes the benefit of science to your advantage. That's where we're going with diabetes. That way, we don't have to do what we do now, which is to say, you really need to cut back on sweets and you need to exercise more. Okay, fine. I mean, who doesn't need to do that? That's a general blanket statement. That's what we give. That's still the best we can do sometimes. We need more than that. Because of all the factors I described at the beginning of the talk, we need more than that. And that's what we're aiming to do now. And UCSF is really at the forefront of precision medicine, because we have Computational Sciences Institute dedicated to this, and all of the areas of science ranging from cancer to diabetes, where I work, is focusing on this principle as well. And so that's the future. That's where we're going with diabetes, treatment, management, and prevention. And I hope that, we can really change the game for people in this, and then really I can reach that point in my career where we are actually eliminating a lot of cases of heart disease, which is why I went into this in the first place. So I'll stop there with my part, and I think we have a few minutes. I'd love to take questions and maybe even discuss some of these topics. And anything else that's on your mind if I didn't touch on it during my time.
I'd like to ask something about weight loss.
Yep.
And dieting. Everybody here, I think, knows that being overweight is a risk factor. Tries to lose weight, makes good resolutions, and you can lose up to a certain point, a set point, and then the diet goes out the window.
Yes.
And what's going on there?
Great question. So, the question is that if being overweight is bad, then losing weight is good. And why can't we lose the amount of weight we desire to lose? Why do we plateau out and fail to lose beyond a certain weight when most people try to lose weight? So first of all, let me show of hands. Who here has either tried or knows somebody, who's tried a diet? Okay, very common, right? Who here has gone on an exercise plan to try to lose weight? or know somebody who has. Again, very common. So it gets back to the point in the middle of the talk. It was made in a different context, but it's relevant to this. We talked about, you mentioned winter as the reason why we save. Well, you know what? Our bodies have evolved the ability to save also. We call this phenotype thriftiness. Okay, and there are many genes in our gene pool that are so-called thrifty genes. So we've evolved, this is the key point, we've evolved as a species, mammals in general, but humans as well, have evolved to survive in the face of little to no food. That's what we're geared for. That's why we have adipose tissue, or fat, so that we can live off of the energy from our fat when there's no food around. Okay? That's the purpose of that tissue, in addition to warmth and a few other things. And so, if you go back to images of famines in your mind's eye, or even images from World War II concentration camps, people would be emaciated in those situations. And the reason that they look emaciated is because they've lost all that fat. Okay? But they're still alive. Amazingly, the human body is so resilient that it can withstand not having food for that long and still somehow survive. And the reason is because we have all these redundant systems in place to prevent dying from starvation. As a mammalian class, over millions of years. And as human beings over maybe 20 million plus years. Okay? Alright, now, what does that have to do with this question? When we try to lose weight purposely, our bodies cannot interpret the difference between that and losing weight unintentionally, like what would happen if we just didn't have access to food. Okay? And so our bodies shift into this reactive mode to preserve ourselves in the face of what it views to be starvation. It doesn't realize that we're doing it purposely for good health reasons and all that. Body doesn't have any way of knowing. And so what happens is that our basal metabolic rate drops when we're trying to lose weight below a certain amount. Our heart rate even goes down a little bit when we're trying to lose weight beyond a certain amount. Our body temperature drops just a little bit. We don't notice it, but it is the case. And all of those things reduce the way we burn energy. It reduces our expenditure of energy. So we're eating less because we're trying to lose weight, but we're also burning less energy at the same time. So in the end, we reach a plateau and we don't lose any more weight, despite our ongoing efforts. And that phenomenon is true whether we do it with diet or whether we do it with weight loss drugs. Even the weight loss drugs, you just don't keep going like this until you decide you reach the weight you want. You lose about 5-10 pounds and then it just stops. And so when you reach that point in the diet or the weight loss drug, you are staying on the diet or continuing to pay the copay for the drug to keep off the weight you've already lost, but you're not going to lose any more weight. So that's something that we just have to understand. So how do you break that and get even more weight loss? Well, one of the things we've learned is the slower you lose the weight, the more weight you can lose over the long term. The faster you lose the weight, the more likely that reactive survival instinct in our body is going to kick in and we're going to stop further weight loss. So I recommend losing weight slowly. It's not as desirable because people want to, especially young people, want to look like the pictures on the magazine. And so they want the weight loss to happen fast because they're doing it for cosmetic reasons in many ways. But if you're doing it for health reasons and you have the patience to do it slowly, just realize that you can think of it another way, right? So if you eat one Ritz cracker more per day, let's just say you ate everything that you normally eat, don't change anything, but you add one Ritz cracker on top of that with dinner each day. And you did that from the time you were 40 to the time you were 60. You would put on average, somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds that you wouldn't have put on otherwise. That's how finely tuned our body's balance of energy in and energy out otherwise is. Now that's kind of disappointing that it's that that little that it takes. But same thing is true the other way. If you were 40 and you'd made a decision that you were going to eat one Ritz cracker less worth of food, you wouldn't notice it on a daily basis. It's such a small amount of food. But if you replicated that across every meal for 20 years, you would gain 15 to 20 pounds less than you would otherwise gain. So you would avoid developing that level of overweight that you might have otherwise just associated with midlife, and yet not necessarily realize. But it happens over that 10 to 20 year time horizon. So if you start now, in 2 or 3 years, you'll notice a big difference, but you won't notice it in like 12 weeks or something like that. But if you do something that you notice in 12 weeks, you're likely to either stop or yo-yo back to your old weight and have that kind of, unwanted cycle of up and down weight loss and regain. So, you have a question?
Have you found any?
Have you found anything that helps neuropathy of the feet?
Right. So neuropathy is a very, very unpleasant sensation in the legs and in the feet in particular. Sometimes one more than the other, sometimes both. And oftentimes people describe it as like a foot falling asleep kind of sensation, like buzzing, pins and needles kind of feeling. But sometimes it's really bad, like it's much more than the standard pins and needles kind of sensation. And it's associated with diabetes. It's one of the complications. The reason why it occurs is because the blood vessels are fundamentally damaged over time in diabetes. And these little tiny blood vessels that invade our nerves and nourish our nerves are not immune to that. They are also damaged with diabetes. And that damage tends to affect our nerves. And it doesn't affect the short nerves. It affects the really long nerves that depend on the blood supply the most. And the longest nerves in our body, among them anyways, are the ones that go from our spinal cord all the way down to our feet. That's why the neuropathy tends to happen in the feet and in the tips of the fingers, sometimes in the hands, because those nerves are really long and they're prone to that damage with chronic diabetes. So your point is well taken. We don't have very good medicines for painful neuropathy. The best thing that I've seen work for painful neuropathy is working on the diabetes itself. When the diabetes gets better, and the so-called hemoglobin A1C, the blood test that we measure to track your diabetes, gets better, after about 6 months, a lot of people do report that the neuropathy is resolving, and they're feeling a lot better about those symptoms. And that is very important, because one of the things about diabetes that's, in some ways, the worst aspect of it is the alterations in mood and outlook on life that occur in the context of the diabetes, and the pain and suffering that goes along with neuropathy is one of those things that just makes people downcast. And when that feels better, they feel better, and then it's a positive cycle, because then they do more for their diabetes, and you get this beneficial kind of set of effects. So improving the diabetes can really be very beneficial. Beyond that, the medicine that we use the most are medicines called gabapentin and pregabalin, and they don't work all that well for many people. Secondly, though, it also depends on whether people report the neuropathy at night when they're trying to sleep, and whether the primary problem is that the painful sensation keeps them from getting a good night's sleep, or whether it's bothering them during the day. One of the reasons why gabapentin and pregabalin don't quote-unquote work all that well is because the dose that you need to get rid of the symptoms makes people too drowsy or dizzy or just kind of like confused a little bit sometimes. And so they can't take it during the day because they can't take the right dose. But if you only take it at night before bedtime, sometimes people don't notice those feelings because they're asleep, and then the neuropathy can be controlled. So sometimes I just limit the medicine to nighttime, right before bedtime, and it tends to work at least to prevent the feelings while you're sleeping so you can get a good night's sleep. And sometimes that's as much as people want. And so there's that kind of management-related aspect to it as well.
What do you consider an anti-inflammation diet?
Right. So
Repeat the question.
yeah. The question was about, what do you consider an anti-inflammation diet? So one of the things about advancing age that we think is relevant to a lot of diseases that we associate with aging is inflammation. And obesity, we think, does some of the damage, including producing diabetes through accelerating inflammation in the body. And so one of the things that has been put out there then is that if you can just reduce inflammation, maybe you can ward off some of the ill effects of diseases like obesity. And so what can you do to create that anti-inflammatory situation through diet? So the answer is we don't know specifically, in that many diets can be healthy in that way. There's no magic single diet that can produce that we know of. That said, the one that has the most data to support it is what we call the Mediterranean diet. Now that's not to say that other diets may not be better. It's not to say that other diets can't do what the Mediterranean diet does. I think what I say about the Mediterranean diet is mostly because it has just the most data to support it. The most studies on the most people have been done focusing on the Mediterranean diet. But I can go beyond that to say that there are some common features present in multiple diets, including the vegan diet, the paleo diet, the Mediterranean diet, and thinking about gluten-free, which many people espouse any of those diets for anti-inflammatory. If you read the right book, you'll find that the person says the same thing, except it's a different diet that they're saying it about. So one of the things is, like Michael Pollan says in his books, it's a common theme that runs across all these. Eat fresh food. Okay, we think that a lot of the pro-inflammatory aspects of food comes from processing of food. So try to avoid eating foods that are in boxes and bags in favor of foods that are prepared fresh, from fresh ingredients. Okay? If you're going to eat foods that are in boxes and bags, try to pick foods that have the shortest ingredient list. That's because that means that they're least full of unneeded ingredients, most of which are preservatives. Fruits and vegetables. All of the diets espouse the importance of fruits and vegetables. So I would say that if you're going to focus on fresh foods, focus on fresh fruits and vegetables. A good way to know that you're doing that is to have color in the plate. If you say, I want color in the plate, probably you're getting enough fruits and vegetables, if you think about that at every meal. Third, whole grains. That's another important component that none of these diets says, no, it's okay if you eat processed grains. Whole grains, high fiber. So if you're going to look on a label, look for fiber. If the fiber is high, the grain is probably whole grain, almost certainly. Okay, they go hand in hand. And finally, with respect to meats, a lot of data now. A lot of data showing that, that red meat has within it, in the protein as well as in the fat, elements that produce inflammation and poor health that is associated with inflammation. So if you can limit the amount of red meat on a weekly basis to maybe 1 or 2 servings of red meat on a weekly basis or less, as opposed to every meal or every day, that would probably be a good thing in favor of lean meats. And for the fats, we ask people to limit, if not eliminate, saturated fat from the diet and focus on healthy fats, omega-3 fats and unsaturated fats. Okay, so the omega-3 fats are the fats that come from fish for the most part, fish oils, and the polyunsaturated fats are the ones that you get from vegetables. And in particular, we think about the fat in olive oil as being an especially healthy one, and that's mainstay in the Mediterranean diet.
Gone a bit over our time,
Yes.
so let's adjourn. Maybe Dr. Koliwad will stay a
I'm
little
happy
longer to answer some questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.